Hi everyone. Just checking if the audio is working. Can you please let me know if you can hear me clearly? Yes, the beard is gone. I had an unfortunate razor-related incident yesterday. All right, guys. So while we're waiting, um, if you have any questions about the previous session, this is a good time to ask. I've decided to just start 10 to 15 minutes early, just to make sure any technical problems are taken care of. Um, Let me just make sure my whiteboard is visible. And yes, it is. It should be fine. And that is me. And back to the screen share. All right, it looks like everything is in good shape. So, guys, any questions from last time? Anything, any doubts? Any questions? Of course, related to photography. Hey, Ashwin, good to see you on the stream. Yeah, no dance moves. I'll put the cat up on the screen so you can see her moving around a bit. All right. I don't think anyone has any questions from last time. Let's just wait for people to join in the stream. Uh, I'll announce the next session at the end of the workshop, but just for the people who are already on the stream, we'll have the next one on Saturday. So that'll be session three. I'll have to, of course, go over the outline again at 11 o'clock, but just for the people who are already on the stream, we are at this part of, of the, of the course curriculum. So we're working on this part of it right now, which is understanding exposure, the exposure triangle, metering, and a few other related concepts. So this is what we'll go over today. Um, After that, we're going to move on to the creative use of exposure parameters. So basically, what we're talking about today. But after that, we will go over how you use those parameters creatively. So Lilesh is asking us, can you briefly inform us about Shutter School? All right, so that's a bit of a long story. So Suhas Desley, who's an incredible photographer who is now making motion pictures, and I many years ago decided to start a workshop because we believed that the way photography was being communicated was inefficient and maybe not the best for students. So we decided to do our own series of workshops, and none of them were short workshops. There are many workshops which try to cover the basics of photography in 1 hour or 4 hours. I don't think that can work. Um, so we decided to make a series of workshops. I think this was way back in 2013 or 2014. We created a lot of content and we did a series of workshops that lasted for a few years. Through Shutter School, I think we trained over 300 to 400 photographers, and some of them are excellent photographers on their own right. Some of them will be on the live stream right now, and I'll actually be conducting sessions with a few of them. So, Shutter School, the legacy of Shutter School is that we created all this content. Now, over time, Suhas and I both didn't have time to continue it for various reasons. Life gets in the way of many of these activities. Uh, but I have all this content, and it's a shame to just see it sitting on my computer and not being shared with the world. So that's why I decided to take all that content, put it up online for all of you guys to see. So this is basically the content of the paid workshops we used to do. And there's a lot of content. So photography 101 was just one of the workshops we used to do. There's one for lighting, basically using flash photography, creative lighting. There's one on post processing, using Lightroom, using Photoshop. We have a bunch of content, and it is my honest intention to put all that content up online for all of you guys. So that's what I hope to do in the coming month or so. I hope that answered your question, Dilesh. It's a very long answer for a very short question, but I tend to ramble on. All right. Any any more questions, guys, before we get started? Yeah, thank you. So the we spent so much time on this on putting all this content together. Uh, it's just a shame not to use it. So I'm glad I actually finally got to doing the workshops again. So it's a fun little activity for me. Tejas, so regarding depth of field, you can see that that's an entire session. So if you look at my screen right now, and you look at the parameters we're going to be talking about, so creative use of exposure parameters is the next session, and that's going to cover depth of field and shutter speed. So it's not trivial in the sense that it's not something that can be covered in one session. So that's why I've kept it aside for a different session. I could explain it to you very briefly, but I don't think it has much value. I think it's better if we just go through the whole course material that I put together about depth of field. You'll understand it better. I have live demos now, so you can see a live demo of depth of field and all those things. It's difficult for me to set it up right now because my setup is not set up. My cameras and all are not set up to show you depth of field right now. All right, we still have 7 minutes to go. I'm happy to answer any questions. My cat is getting extremely restless, so I might have to kick her out of the room. Oh God, this is not good. Okay. So if you see me get up and leave, that's just because I'm moving the cat out of the room. She is getting extremely restless right now. It's her bird watching time, and she's not very happy sitting next to me. Hey Amrut, good to see you, man. Long time. Bhuvnesh, so hey, are you? Good to see you, and I hope your arm is recovered. Bhuvnesh, that's an extremely time-consuming topic. So printing in itself is just a workshop by itself, right? So it seems really simple on the surface about how to make a print, but there are so many things that can go wrong when you make a print, and so many ways in which so many parameters you need to take care of when you make a print. That's very difficult to give you like a brief overview of printing. It's not possible to give you a brief overview. But if anyone says it is possible, they're lying. Let me just put it that way. I could give you a brief overview, but that I'd be doing the subject a great injustice. So, and I'd be doing you a great injustice by giving you a short version of it. So don't worry, we're going to be talking about printing. We're going to be talking about at least whatever I know about printing. I've had a great deal of experience over the last few years with printing just because I was handling some of the printing work for the big exhibition, DrishtiCon, along with a bunch of other people. Ashwin, who is on the stream, was also involved, greatly involved in the printing process. So that's why it's a long topic, and we definitely will talk about it, but just not today and not right now in a couple of minutes. I'm sorry, that's just how it is. Uh, Again, please. Forgive me, but keep in mind that if I say that we can't talk about it right now, it's not that I don't want to talk about it. It's just that it's such a long and complicated answer that answering it in a couple of minutes feels like I'm not giving you the right information. That's why. Amongst the gadgets that you own, is there something that you wish you hadn't bought? Oh, that's a rough one. So I generally overthink my gadget purchases, so I take a long time to think about stuff before I buy something. So generally, I don't get buyer's remorse. But let me think about it. Uh, yeah, I think, and this might be slightly controversial. So one of the worst lenses I ever purchased was the Canon 50 mm 1.4. Uh, that's a really old lens. That was a 1990s design lens, which Canon was still selling all the way. I think they're still selling it, and they sell it in 2020. I'm not sure. I'm not shooting Canon anymore, but I think they shoot. I think they still sell that lens. Someone who owns the Canon system can chime in on the chat. It was just not a very good lens. I had constant trouble with focusing. I could not, even with micro focus adjustment, I couldn't fix it. So it's just not a very good lens. I sold it as quickly as I could. All right, only a few more minutes to go, and then we'll get started. Sagar, yes, we are. We are going to be exploring Lightroom to a degree. If you look at my course outline, it's right here. It's in the introduction to software tools. So I'll be doing one session. So Photoshop is extremely complicated. Photoshop is going to be really tough to cover, but Lightroom we can definitely get a start on. So we'll definitely talk about Lightroom, and that will be an entire session in itself. Umesh, so honestly, at that point in time, I felt like Nikon's. So I switched way back in 2015. Uh, yeah, I really hate that lens, Ashwin. So I switched to Nikon way back in 2015, I think. And at that time, so Canon only had the 60 and the 5D Mark III at that time, and I needed more resolution for some of the work I was doing. So that time, the only option in the market was to buy a Nikon D810, which was 36 megapixels. So that's realistically why I wanted to switch. Now, if you ask me that same question today, I would have not switched. If I had a 5D Mark IV or any current Canon system, EOS R, I would not have switched today. At that time, the thing was different. Yeah, anyone who had the 51.4 can relate to my pain. Right? So anyone who has that lens, so Tarun has had experience with that. It was not a fun lens to use. The photos, on the other hand, were great, but it was just really painful to use. So that's why I didn't enjoy that lens, and I got rid of it as quickly as I could. Maybe it's better on mirrorless now. I don't know, but I was shooting that lens on a 6D and a 5D Mark IV, and it was just terrible. Key. So how to get everyone of a family of 4 or 5 focus in f2.8. So that we're going to be covering in depth of field. So that's next time's topic. Wow, Pratik. So they still sell that lens. Yeah, that's not good. I think that's almost criminal to sell that lens now. That lens is, I think, out of the 1990s. I don't know when it was released. I think it was 94, 95. Okay, 15 seconds to go for us to start. Any other questions? Otherwise, after this, we'll have to narrow down the general questions. Uh, we'll have to narrow down the general questions to the topic of today. Sagar, yes, we do actually. I'm going to be conducting a session on wedding photography with some great wedding photographers. We're going to be doing a joint question answer session about wedding photography. I have a few photographers who are really interested to come on board and talk about their experience with wedding photography. I can share mine as well. So we are definitely doing that, and that's happening next week, I think. Okay, guys, it's 11 o'clock, so let's get started. I don't want to waste any more time. Let me just get my presentation up online. All right, just give me 1 second while I get everything set up. Okay, all right, we're ready to go. So, to begin with, I'm obviously going to ask about. I'm going to mention this. So, all of our sessions are at an absolute minimum going to take 1 hour of your time. Right? I don't think it's possible to do anything productive in less than that amount of time. So if you can stick around for the whole thing, I really appreciate your patience. But this is just the reality of how it's going to work. We're going to need an hour, about an hour, maybe even more sometimes, to go over all the content that I have lined up. Usually this is done in person, so I'd be in front of you in a classroom, but this is the reality of the situation we find ourselves in. Okay, so let's get started. So today we're talking about understanding exposure. Right? So this is what we're going to be talking about. This is session two. But before we get started, I just wanted to talk about a few other things about the reality we find ourselves in. So our Honorable Prime Minister has announced a 21-day shutdown. Now, I know a lot of you people, and a lot of people have been talking to me, and they're struggling with this idea of being shut in for 21 days. So I agree, it's a frustrating time for all of us. It's not great to be locked up at home for 21 days, which you definitely should be. You should be at home. You should not be going out and exposing yourself or your friends and family to this pandemic. But it's equally more important to think of this in another way as a blessing. So we have 21 days, right? It's 21 days. So I'd like everyone to at least consider the idea that in 21 days, we could either not do anything and complain about it, or we can come out of this stronger, better, knowing more. Right? So it's a commitment I've made for myself, and I encourage you to join in that at the end of these 21 days, I fully expect myself to be both fitter, both mentally and physically. So that's a commitment I've made for myself. This is not a prison sentence. This we're doing this for the good of everyone else. We're doing this for our own health and for everyone else's health, and we can take this as an opportunity in 21 days to become better at something and come out of this in better shape than we went into it. So that's what I would really like to add to this whole thing, right? So let's get back to our presentation. So today's session two is all about understanding exposure. Understanding exposure is basically talking about concepts of exposure. So before that, we have to go over some basic terminology. So let me just make my face a little smaller so you can see the, the presentation a little better. Hold on. Let's make my screen, I put myself in the bottom so that you can see me. Yeah. So before that, we have to go over some basic terminology. We can't photography, just like everything else, has its own language. A lot of you are IT professionals, a lot of you are skilled professionals in your own fields. So you have your own terminology for things that only people in your field would really understand. Now, you don't use this terminology to show off. You use this terminology to accurately communicate information to people in the same field that you're in. So and some of the times those terms are somewhat esoteric. They don't really make sense to people who are outside that field. But it's essential for the person you're communicating with to know those things so that you can meaningfully communicate information. So Just like that, photography has its own language. It has its own language. It has its own terminology, which is used in somewhat unusual ways. So these are the most common terms that we have to start with, and we have to establish that we understand the meaning of these terms. So first of all, the most basic term, exposure. What is exposure? Right? So there's a lot of misinformation about it, and I'm going to just keep it absolutely simple. So when we talk about exposure, when photographers talk about exposure, we're only talking about how bright or dark the image is. We're not talking about what shutter speed was used to create that image. We're not talking about the ISO. We're not talking about the aperture. All we're talking about is how bright or dark is the image. That's what it means, right? So let me just put that on our whiteboard, right? So let me just write that down. So what is exposure? Simply how bright or dark the, right? That's all it means, right? So how bright or dark is the image? So that's what exposure means. Now, related to exposure, you have other concepts. So, and these are terms which are also used in slightly weird ways, right? So you have the idea of underexposure and overexposure, right? So these two terms, underexposure and overexposure. Now, these terms are generally not used. It's they're generally used appropriately, but it's hard, it's important for us to understand the real meaning behind these terms. So when you say something is underexposed, or when a photographer communicates to you that something is underexposed, what they're actually trying to say is something is darker than what you expect, or too dark. When a photographer or when someone says something is overexposed, it's brighter or too bright. Now, some of you may have noticed something interesting about these terms. I'm always saying brighter and darker, or too dark and too bright. Now, I want you to think about, imagine a scene in your home. If a guest comes home, very unusual these days, of course, but if you're at home in your 21 days and you make a cup of coffee, or your spouse makes you a cup of coffee, or someone at home makes you a cup of coffee, and you have a sip of it, and it's too sweet, right? Someone says, too sweet. Now, is this a meaningful term? Does this make sense? Sorry, guys, 1 second. My cat is acting up, and my cat just disconnected my screen. Just give me 1 second. Let me get it back online. Sorry, guys, give me 1 second. I'm going to have to take her out of the room. Sorry, 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 sorry. Come, come, come. Yeah, sorry about that. Cat-related incidents. Anyone who has a cat or has a pet will know. Okay, so let's get back to this. Let me wait for my screen to come back online. Here we go. Okay, so back to this. So let's say someone gives you a cup of coffee and you say it's too sweet. Now the word too is a really hard term to quantify because this is a subjective term, right? This is a subjective term. What do I mean by subjective? By subjective, I mean it depends on the person who's experiencing something, right? It depends on experience. Subjective varies based on the viewer or the person who's experiencing something. So if you say the coffee is too sweet, it's a meaningless term until you understand what the appropriate amount of sugar is, right? So if someone says something is too sweet or someone says something is too bright or too dark, the obvious question is, okay, it may be too bright or too dark, but what's the right amount? What are you comparing it against? So let me give you another example. So let's say, and again, I apologize for my drawing. So let's say this is a photograph, right? We are taking this photograph. And this photograph, everyone has experienced something like this. This is a beach. This is the sun. Let me just give it some color so it looks something like the sun. right? There's a sun here. Oh, my drawings are just awful. And this is a person walking on the beach. Now, everyone's experienced this, everyone's seen this postcard where the person here is a silhouette in the sense that they're completely dark, but you can see the sun in the background. So now the obvious question is this overexposed, underexposed, or correct? Right? This is the question you have to ask yourself. Now, what I want you to think about is that it could be any one of these three, depending on what your expectations are. Right? So let's say my expectation was that I wanted to see a silhouette. I wanted to see this person dark, but I wanted to see the sun, the detail in the sun. Everyone's seen photos like this, right? So in that case, this is correct. But what happens if my expectation was to see the person's face, not dark? I didn't want to see them as a silhouette. I wanted to actually see detail in the person's face. Then this photograph is definitely too dark, right? So now the same photograph has become underexposed. Why can the photo be overexposed? If you can't see detail inside the sun, that means that even though you have a silhouette in the photo is still overexposed, right? So now you have Schrodinger's photo, right? You have the same photo in three states. Now, what is the only thing which is determining which one of these three things is correct? You are. So you're the viewer, right? So you decided whether something was overexposed, underexposed, or correctly exposed, right? So this is important. So when we come back to the ideas of underexposure and overexposure, we have to remember that these are subjective. They vary based on the viewer, right? They're not objective terms. So now we understand that overexposure and underexposure are subjective terms. So let's define them. Underexposure is any exposure. And what is exposure? How bright or dark is the photo? So it's any exposure which is darker than what you expect or what you desire. Overexposure is any, don't let her in. Don't let her in. I know, but she's being very so she's being very okay, 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 okay. Sorry guys. Sorry, another character related incident. So back to this underexposure and overexposure are subjective terms. If a photo is underexposed, it's darker than what you expect. If a photo is overexposed, it's brighter than what you expect. That's all it means, brighter or darker, versus some baseline that you set for yourself. Okay, so now let's get back to some objective terms. So we've defined three terms so far, right? We defined exposure. Related to that, we defined underexposure and we defined overexposure. Now let's define another term, the idea of stops. Okay, so let's talk about the idea of stops. Now, what are stops? Stops are an objective way of communicating how much brighter or darker a subject is versus your expectation, or versus how bright or dark a photo is compared to what you want, right? So, related to stops, you have the idea of stop up, stop down, right? What does stop up mean? Stop up means to make something brighter, to make a photo brighter. Stop down means to make something darker, to make a photo darker. But remember, this is objective. This is not subjective. You can actually tell exactly how much brighter or darker you want with the idea of stops. Okay, so what is a stop is basically a unit. So what is one stop up? It means you're making a photo two times brighter by whatever means you want. It doesn't matter how you're doing it. It just matters that the exposure is twice as much as it was before, right? And one stop down means that it is half as bright, right? The value is half as much as it was before. It is darker by how much? It's darker by half. The brightness of the exposure is half as much as it used to be before. Now, how do you do this? You can do this however you want, by whatever means you want, right? So that's what it means. So these are the ideas of stops and these are the ideas of overexposure and underexposure. So let's go again. And the reason why I'm belaboring this point, why I'm going over this again and again, is because these are really important terms. These are terms we use to communicate to each other all the time. So it's important that we get these terms right. We have to have these terms right. Right? So again, It's exposure, and exposure can be under and over. Both these terms are subjective. We have stops. You can stop up or you can stop down. By how much? By a number of stops. So one stop up or down. And this means half or double in brightness. And these are objective measures. This is all objective. Now, again, what does objective mean? Objective means it doesn't change based on my opinion, right? One stop up is one stop up no matter who's looking at it. One stop down is one stop down no matter who's looking at it, right? So that's why it's important to understand the difference between objective and subjective measures. So I'm going to take a second right now to see if anyone has any questions because it's important everyone sort of understands this, if this is clear for everyone. So I'm just going to look at the chat. So everyone here is basically worried about my cat. Don't worry about my cat. She's sitting outside. She just doesn't want to be away from me for too long. And if I let her in, she'll bite something or sabotage some cable. It's already happened, so I'm not going to let her in. Right? Sorry, you can see her later next time. Okay, so I don't see any questions about this stuff yet. I'm just going to wait a few more minutes if anyone has any questions. Nope, doesn't look like it. All right, so let's just move on. Okay, so the next term. So now we get to the famous exposure triangle. All right, let me make myself a little smaller so you can see. All right, so this is the very famous exposure triangle. Now, why is this important? So the exposure triangle, I don't like this infographic as such, but it basically communicates one really important fact about photography. There are only three parameters that control exposure. Only three. Remember this. There are only three things that control exposure. That's the ISO, the shutter speed, and the aperture. Right? So that's the only thing. And I'll just go to the next slide. So how do you control exposure? You only basically have three tools. And what are the three tools? You can vary time, which is the shutter speed. You can vary the amount of light, which is the aperture, or you can vary the sensitivity of the medium, which is the ISO. Now, this might seem like a little too much right now, but I'm going to go over each one of those very, very quickly. Right, so let's move on to the next slide. All right. So now let's talk about this. So let's look at the shutter speed scale. So this is the shutter speed scale. I'm just going to move on to my whiteboard so you can see what we're talking about. So let's talk about the three parameters that control exposure. There's the shutter speed, the ISO, and the aperture. Right? Only three things. Now, and by only three things, I mean it. It's universal. From the time photography was invented, we talked about it in photo history way back in 1838, till today, and till the end of time, there are only going to be three things because there are only three ways to make a photo or to make light hit a light sensitive medium and create an image out of it. And there are only three ways to vary that exposure. So that's the shutter speed. Now, what is the shutter speed? The shutter speed is simply the amount of time the film or the sensor is exposed to light. That's all it is, right? And it's got a weird name. It's called shutters. It's called shutter speed. Speed is a rate of doing something, which is wrong. It should just be called exposure time, right? How long are you letting light hit the film? How long are you letting light hit the sensor? That's all exposure. That's all shutter speed really is. And shutter speed is measured in seconds or fractions of a second. Right, is measured in seconds or fractions of a second. If you look at our presentation, sorry, just give me 1 second, we'll move back to our presentation. If you look at our presentation, you'll see that shutter speed is measured in units of time. So you can have a fast shutter speed. So a fast shutter speed is one where the shutter is open or light is let into the camera for a very short duration of time. It could be as little as 1 by 100. Some of our cameras can go as fast as 1 by 8,000th of a second, right? That's faster, literally faster than the blink of an eye, right? So that's shutter speed. That's how shutter speed is used to control exposure. Now, related to shutter speed, so I just want to make sure that everyone's very clear about one thing about exposure and shutter speed and the related concepts of shutter speed. So this is a thought exercise that I use for all my students. So imagine that you're sitting inside, again, excuse the crudity of my diagrams, right? This is a room and it's a completely dark room. There are no windows in this room, right? There's no other way for light to get in. Inside this, there's a light bulb. Now let me put some color in there, right, to make it more fascinating, right? Inside this room is a light bulb. There's a switch for the light bulb right here. And in this room, you have a camera sitting on a tripod, right? This is the camera sitting on the tripod. I'm not going to draw a human being because I suck at drawing human beings. So let's look at two cases in this situation, right? So, case one, all right? In the first case, the light bulb is on. So this is the bulb. The bulb, I'm going to call that B. B is on, right? This is the initial state, but the bulb is on. The camera is set to a 30, let's give it a reasonable number. The camera is set for 10-second shutter speed, right? And you fire this exposure, you shoot this exposure, and then you get a photograph, right? You get some photograph. Whatever this photograph is, I'm not going to draw the content of the photograph. It could be anything, just use your imagination, right? So basically, here's what happens. The bulb is on, just like this room I'm in right now. I set the camera for a 10-second exposure and I fire it and I get some photograph of whatever is there, right? Now, that's the first case. The second case, this is the interesting case. In this case, the bulb is off initially, right? The bulb is off initially. The camera is set for a 30-second exposure. Remember this, 30-second exposure. And then in the middle of these 30 seconds, in the middle of this 30-second exposure, so if you think of a timeline, this is the 30 seconds, right? This is the 30 seconds for which the camera is letting light inside. The shutter is open for 30 seconds. In the middle of these 30 seconds, I switch on the light bulb B for 10 seconds. Right? The bulb is on for 10 seconds and then I switch it off again. And then I get a photograph. Right? This is the photograph I get. Whatever that may be. Use your imagination. Right? Nothing else has changed. So let's go over the two cases again. In the first case, the bulb is on and I fire a 10-second exposure and I get a photograph. In the second case, the bulb is off. The camera fires for 30 seconds. In the middle of the 30 seconds, I switch the camera on and off for 10 seconds. And then I get another exposure. Will there be a difference between exposure 1 and exposure 2? Now that's the question you need to ask yourselves. Will there be a difference? Right? I'm going to give you a few seconds to think about this. Maybe 5 or 6 seconds to think about this, and then I'm going to give you the answer. Right? So here's the answer. The answer is that no, there will be no difference between 1 and 2. Why? The only thing that matters for an exposure is how long light is hitting the sensor, how long light is hitting the film or the sensor in the back of that camera. Whether that happens because of the shutter opening and closing, or whether that happens because of me switching on and off a light bulb in a completely dark room, does not matter, right? So the only thing that matters for exposure in this particular case is the amount of time light hits the sensor, right? So that's really important for you all to know. Okay, so now we have that thought exercise out of the way, and I'll be using this in a few other situations. The same experiment we'll be talking about in a few other situations. But now let's relate the idea of stops to shutter speed. Right? Let's relate these ideas. How do we link these ideas? We know what stops are. Stops are a way of communicating relative exposure. It's a way of communicating, okay, this is the exposure, I wanted to make it twice as bright. This is the exposure, I wanted to make it half as bright. So that's what stops are there for communicating. Remember, we talk about it as stop up and stop down, right? So now Let's relate it to shutter speeds. So shutter speeds are measured in seconds. So let's say we have an exposure of 1 second, right? Let's say we make a photo with a 1 second exposure. I tell you that no, this is wrong. Sure, it's subjective, but sure, I say that this is overexposed. This shot is overexposed. So I want you to stop it down by one stop. Now listen to the meaning, right? I want you to stop down by one stop. What does that mean? It means that I want you to make the exposure half as bright, assuming all the other parameters are exactly the same, right? So we're not changing aperture, we're not changing ISO. All we are trying to do is control shutter speed, right? So we have a 1 second exposure. What is one stop down to 1 second? How do I make a 1 second exposure half as bright? The answer is obvious. I just shoot it for half the time. So I shoot it for half a second. So this is one stop down, right? Let's go the other way around. Let's say I had, sorry, my iPad is acting up. I don't know what's happening there, but sorry, I'm going to have to kill the whiteboard and start it up again. Yeah, okay, here we are again. All right, so let's start with another example. So let's say I was shooting 1/100th of a second. So it's a relatively fast exposure. And I tell you that, you know what, you shot this exposure, but this is too dark. It needs to be brighter. It needs to be, it's two stops too dark. So what do I mean by that? I mean, you shot it, but it's two stops too dark, meaning it's 4 times too dark, right? It's not twice as dark, it's 4 times too dark. So how do I change this? So what is one stop up? Just one stop up of 1/100. It's 1/50, obviously, because I'm multiplying by 2. And what is one stop again up of 1/50? It's 1/25, right? So this is one stop up, this is one stop up. So the sum total of 1/25, 1/25 seconds are two stops up from 1/100th of a second. So this is the idea of stopping up and stopping down in shutter speed. Now, if I go back to my presentation, you can easily tell that it's the same thing, right? So if you look at it, I don't know if I can get a mouse pointer up here, but you can see how one stop increases in exposure go from, let's start from 1/1000. I want to go one stop up from 1/1000, which means I want to make the image twice as bright. I go to 1/500. I want to make twice as bright again. I go to 1/250. I want to make it twice as bright again. I go to 1/125. Right? It's just multiples of 2. Now here's the cool thing about photography, and at least the technical part about photography, right? In realistically speaking, the most difficult calculation you'll ever have to do, assuming you don't do anything really complicated in photography, will be multiplying by 1.4 or dividing by 1.4. These are the most complicated calculations you'll ever have to do. And you'll understand 1.4 when we get to the next part. Right? Okay. So I'm going to just wait a minute again to see if there are any questions on the stream, and then we'll move on. Okay, okay. All right, all right. I'm just going to go back into the stream. Just give me 1 minute. Um, Someone wants me to let Leah. Nope, not gonna happen. Prachiti asks, they say it's always better to shoot underexposed photos. So that's a complicated answer, right? So again, when you say underexposed, what are you comparing it to, right? You need to have an understanding of what the correct exposure is to say it's better to shoot an underexposed image. What I believe when people say that it's better to shoot underexposed images is to preserve highlights, and that's complicated, and we'll talk about it. It's an important part of this, but that will come up later. Okay. Um, there's a slight deviation after 1/125 to 1/60. Omkar, yes, there is. That's just to make it easy to calculate. That's just for ease of calculation. Because if you started doing 1/125 and a half, you would run into situations where you'll get like weird decimal fractions and all. So that's why it's not exactly the same, right? Can you show us how to calculate the proper exposure setting for daylight? Yeah, we're going to come to that. We're going to talk about metering. Uh, is stop and f-stop the same? They're related concepts, but generally when you talk about f-stops, we're talking about stops on the lens. We're talking about f-stops on a lens, not on anything else. Right? Okay. So any other questions before I move on? No? Okay. So let's continue. Let's continue with this. All right. So we've talked about shutter speed. Now let's go to aperture. So like I said, there are only three ways in which you can control exposure, right? There's aperture, there's shutter speed, and then there's ISO. So let's talk about the aperture scale, right? So there's aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, and we're going to be talking about the aperture scale right now. So aperture is basically very simply how much light you're letting into the camera. So shutter speed was how long. Let me just write that down. So shutter speed was how long. Aperture is how much, right? So aperture talks about how much light you're letting into the sensor. So if you look at this, I'm just going to make this a little bigger. So this is a standard DS. This is my film camera, right? So I think everyone can see it now. I'm just going to put it in front of my face so you can all see it, right? So this is a lens. A lens has an aperture. So I'm going to just detach. I'm going to show you a lens that I have here, right? So you can see right through the lens, and you can see an inverted image of me in the back. So this is what's called the wide open aperture. This is the maximum amount of light the lens can let in. Now, how do I control that? Every lens inside it has something called an aperture. It's a series of blades which can close and open to control the amount of light coming in. Right? So I can go from this to this. I can stop up, I can stop down. Now, obviously, in the case of a lens, what does stop up mean? It means let in more light. What does stop down mean? It means let in less light. So if I make the aperture blade small, it obviously means I'm letting in less light. So if I make the aperture small, it means less light. If I let the aperture get big, it means more light. So stop up means let the aperture get larger. Stop down means make the aperture smaller. So that's simple. That's pretty self-explanatory. Right. Okay. Okay. Any questions about this stuff so far, guys? I'm not seeing a live view from the stream anymore, so I'm hoping that this is all working. Sorry, I'm just going to go back into my live stream to see if there are any questions. Just give me 1 second. I have to get back into the live stream. There's a hitch here, and I can't see what's on the stream anymore. Sorry, guys. Just give me 1 second. If the live stream is still on, I apologize. I'm just trying to check if everything is working. Okay. Yeah. It looks like everything is working. Let me just expand this so I know everything is okay. Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for confirming. All right. So I assume that everyone saw the demonstration I did of the demonstration I just did of the aperture, right? I assume everyone just saw that. So so Aditya is asking, can you repeat stop up and stop down in terms of aperture? Sure. So you can see the little graphic I have down there. I'm just going to put that up on the screen share. Okay. So in aperture, forget the numbers for now. Okay. So forget the numbers, but just think about the physical representation of it. When you have a large aperture, which is this large opening, when this opening is large, it means you're letting in more light, right? As you start closing down the aperture, it means you're letting in less light, right? So that's how you control the amount of light coming in. And now, how do you relate this to stops, right? So the aperture scale is a little funny this way. So the aperture scale is in multiples of 1.4, right? So if I go from, let's go from the last one, right? The wide open aperture. So lenses have a wide open aperture. So let me show you that. Let me show you what a wide open aperture looks like again, right? So this is a wide open aperture, okay? Now I can stop it down like this, right? So now just keep that in mind and relate it to what we're looking at here. So the aperture scale, there's a reason why it says f by 2, and we'll talk about that when we talk about lenses and depth of field. But for now, just take it as a number, right? Take it as a representation of a number. So f2 on this lens, let's assume that that is wide open. Now, how do I say one stop down? What do I change in the lens to make it go to one stop down, which is let in half the amount of light? I have to go from f2 to f2.8, right? So you have to go from f2 to 2.8. So, and if you have to go from another stop down, you have to go from 2.8 to f4. Now, what's happening between f2 and 2.8 is that you're closing the aperture such that the area of this circle is getting reduced by half, which means it's letting in half the amount of light, right? And so on and so forth. So let's go back to my little whiteboard and let's talk about my whiteboard. Let's talk about aperture. Okay, let's talk about the aperture scale. Sorry guys, I have no way of controlling if the stream is going through okay or not. It looks fine on my end. I'm not sure why it's having a problem. Let's just hope it fixes itself. Okay, so let's look at the aperture scale. So the aperture scale goes like this. This is an f-stop scale. Like someone asked in the stream, this is an f-stop scale. So it starts, so this lens which I just showed you, this lens, right? This is an f1.4 lens. So 1.4 represents the aperture number, and I'll show you the aperture on a different lens. Just give me 1 second. I'll just wait for my camera to focus on this. Right? You can see the aperture numbers on this lens. So it says 1.8, 2.8, 4, 5.6, 8, 11, 16, 22. Right? So yeah, Omkar, that's exactly right. Great job. So that's exactly how you get that 1.4 number. Right? So it's basically a function of the area, which means it's a function of a square or a root, not like doubling. Right? Good job. So if you have a lens and wide open, meaning the biggest aperture is represented by the number f1.4. If you have to let in half the amount of light, you have to go from 1.4 to 2. It's a reciprocal. So as the numbers get bigger, the apertures get smaller, right? So the next number will be 2.8, the next number will be 4, the next number will be 5.6, next number will be 8, 11, 16, 22. It will go all the way like this. So the difference between each one of these numbers is 1.4. And why it's 1.4, Onkar in the chat has actually explained it. Right? I'm going to leave this up to you as a homework assignment to figure out why it's 1.4. It's really easy to figure out if you think about it. Right? You have a circle. If you want to let in half the amount of light, what do you change? You can't change the radius by half. You actually have to change the area by half. If you have to change the area by half, how do you do it? You actually have to do it by a factor of 1.4. And you can do the math to figure that out. Okay, so now just have a look at the presentation. So one stop increases in exposure re results in increasing the aperture of the lens by double. One stop decrease means the exposure gets half, right? So that's how you stop up and stop down in aperture. So if I have a lens which is set to f2, and I say, okay, you shot this photograph, but the photograph is twice as bright as it should be, meaning it's too bright. I want it to go one stop down. I wanted to go one stop down. So how do you go one stop down? What is one stop down f2? It's actually f by 2.8, right? So remember, as the numbers get bigger, the aperture gets smaller. As the numbers get smaller, the aperture gets bigger. It's a reciprocal relationship, right? So this is just something to keep in mind. So f2 is a larger aperture than f22, which will be a tiny aperture, right? So it's just something to keep in mind. Someone asked, what's the optimal aperture for a landscape? Again, complicated question. We'll get to that when we talk about depth of field. All right. Okay. So let's move on. So this is a nice visual for you to actually see the physical representation. Of course, I showed it to you on a lens, but you can see it on the presentation as well. So this is an f1.8 lens. If you notice, lenses have an aperture number written on them. Uh, so this lens, the lens which I have right now, will have an aperture number written on it. So this one is an f1.4 lens, right? So what does that mean? It means the maximum aperture it can have, the largest aperture it can have is f1.4, right? And I'll get to the physics and the math of it when we talk about lenses, right? For now, just keep that in mind. So in this particular case, in the presentation, the lens which is on there is an f1.8 lens, which means the maximum aperture it has is f1.8. The minimum aperture it has is f22, and it has all the settings in between, right? Omkar asks, if you close the aperture, you're not blocking parts of the image as well. No, you're not. It's the manner in which the lens is designed does not it doesn't block parts of the image hitting the sensor. I'll show you that when we talk about lenses. Right now, we're just talking about exposure. So just think about exposure. How are we controlling brightness? That's all we're talking about right now. Okay, so now we move on to the ISO scale. So remember, three things which control exposure: aperture, shutter speed, ISO. What is aperture? Aperture is how much light you let into the camera. What is shutter speed? How long are you letting the light get into the camera? Now, this is the third one, and this is the interesting one. The ISO is how sensitive is the medium itself. Like if you have a piece of film in your camera, in the olden days you used to use film, and we still use film sometimes, right? This is a film camera. So in this film camera, I have loaded ISO 400 film, which means there's a sensitivity of the film is denoted by ISO 400. Yeah, Amber asks, is F2 and F by 2 the same thing? Yes, we just use F2 as shorthand for F by 2. It's essentially the same thing. Okay. So now in the case of aperture, in the case of ISO represents how sensitive the medium is. So you could have film which is very sensitive to light, you could have film which is not sensitive to light at all. And if you say that the amount of light coming into the camera and the duration for which the light comes into the camera is the same, but you still want to change the exposure. The only other way to change the exposure would be to make the medium more sensitive to light, would be to make the film or the sensor more sensitive to light. And that's where the ISO scale comes in. Okay, so this is the ISO scale, and I'm just going to go back to my little whiteboard. All right, so let's talk about ISO, right? So ISO, also known as ASA earlier, the American Standards Association. ISO, everyone knows, is the International Standards Association, right? So why is it an International Standard Association? It literally means that it's a standard. There are minor variations based on camera to camera, film to film, but generally the guarantee is that ISO 100 on your camera should give you an equally sensitive sensor compared to ISO 100 on another camera. Why is this important? When you say something like, let's say I've shot a photograph, let's say I have an exposure, which is 1 by 100, shutter speed, f by 4, aperture, and ISO 100. If I shot this with my uh, with my film camera, right? and I shoot the same thing. I shoot exactly the same settings with my digital camera. The guarantee should be that both these things will give me the same exposure. And again, what does exposure mean? Exposure means how bright or dark is the image, right? So both of these should give me the same brightness of the photograph. Now remember, I'm not talking about quality, I'm not talking about colors, I'm not talking about anything else. I'm just talking about exposure, how bright or dark is the photo, that's all, right? Okay. So now how's the ISO scale measured? It's very easy. It starts with ISO 100. 100 is the least sensitive, and it goes all the way up to whatever the current generation of cameras can do. So it goes from ISO 100 to 200. So every doubling of ISO is one stop, right? Every increase of ISO, every doubling of ISO is one stop. So if you go from ISO 100 to ISO 200, this gives you 2x the exposure or double the brightness, right? So this is one stop up. If you go from 100 to 200, this is one stop up. If you go from 800 to 1600, this is also one stop up. But if you go the other way, if you go from 800 to 400, you're making the light sensitive material half as sensitive as light. So this is one stop down. Cool. So this is how the ISO scale works. So together the ISO, the shutter speed, and the aperture completely tell you about the exposure of a photograph. Just the exposure. Now, once again, and I don't mean to belabor this point, but I get asked this question a lot. What about the quality of the image? Does it get affected? Maybe. It may or may not get affected. But the only thing you can determine by knowing these three numbers is the exposure, right? Is the brightness of the photograph. So let's say you shoot a photograph and you want to shoot exactly the same brightness of that photograph. You can vary these parameters to get that brightness. So they only control the brightness of the photograph. Now the aperture and the shutter speed also control other things. But are there any questions about this so far? About the ISO? Let me just put the ISO scale back up so you can see it. Okay, I don't see any questions so far about ISO. All right, so let's move on. Okay, so this is just a summary of all the stuff we talked about. It's the concept of stops and exposure equivalence. So forget forget the bucket analogy. Oh God, the cat's come back in. Okay, all right, come. All right, sorry, my cat's come inside. Okay, so let's get back to the presentation. So stops are a universal way of communicating a change in exposure. We spoke about this. A stop is a stop is a stop, right? So Chirag will get to that part. Yeah, of course, we assume the same light source, right? That's a basic assumption that we make. So stops are a universal way of communicating a change in exposure. One stop up and down in shutter speed or ISO will have the same impact in exposure. Now, what does this mean? Right, this is interesting, and this comes to the idea of exposure equivalence. Okay, so let me just show you that. Let me show you the idea of exposure equivalence. What does exposure equivalence mean? Let's say we're shooting a particular scene. Okay, this is the scene. We're not changing anything about the scene. This scene remains the same. What does that mean? The amount of light in the scene remains exactly the same, right? So you can, let's say, to shoot the scene to get what I consider to be the correct exposure. Correct exposure is subjective, right? I can decide what the correct exposure is. So let's say to get the correct exposure in this scene, so I'm just going to write down shutter speed, ISO, aperture. To get the correct exposure in this scene, I use a shutter speed of 1 by 30 an ISO of 400, an aperture of f by 5.6. Let's say I used these three things. Okay, these are three parameters I used. Now, imagine this. Let's say for some reason, for whatever reason I can think of, I needed to have a shutter speed of 1 by 120 instead, or 125 instead, right? Now, what is the difference here? So 125 is 1 by 30, 1 by 60 to 1 by 125, right? So this is two stops down. If I did not change anything else, if I didn't change anything else, so if I left the ISO at 400 and I left the aperture to 5.6, I would get a scene which was two stops darker than this scene, than the original scene. Right? This scene would be two stops darker. But let's say I really want this 1 by 125 shutter speed. I really need this 1 by 125 shutter speed. Maybe I'm taking a photo of my cat who's running around right now. And I need that shutter speed to make sure that she doesn't move around too much in the frame or she's still in the frame, right? So then that means that I lost two stops because of my shutter speed. I need to gain those two stops back, right? So I could do that in two ways. The first way I could do that is I keep the shutter speed the same. I go up two stops in ISO. So I go from 400 to 800, from 800 to 1600, and I leave the aperture the same. And this scene is equivalent to the original scene in exposure. In exposure, please remember, what I'm talking about is the brightness of the scene. I'm not talking about whether it looks the same. The the reason why I increase the shutter speed is to stop movement, right? Because I stop movement, the photo obviously will look a little different, but the brightness of the photo will be the same. The second way of doing this, the second way of doing this, let's say this is one way of doing this. The second way of doing this is I still want 1 by 125. I have a film camera. Let's say I'm shooting with a film camera, right? I got a film camera right here. So in a film camera, I can't change the ISO. So I'm stuck with the ISO. I'm stuck with 400. So the only thing left for me to control is the aperture. So how does the aperture scale work? It's the amount of light, right? So I have to go from 5.6 to 4 to 2.8, right? So this is one stop, two stops. So this is 2.8, right? I'm just going to erase this. So this exposure, this exposure, this exposure, and this original exposure are all the same. These are called equivalent exposures, right? These are equivalent. So what does that mean? It means that forget the other parameters that have changed. So these three photos will give you photos which are of identical brightness. And you can vary anything up and down by one stop to get the equivalent exposure. So that's why the idea of a stop is really important. That's why everything is calibrated in stops. It's gone, the uh, stops are calibrated such that one stop of exposure in ISO is identical to one stop of exposure change in aperture, is identical to one stop of exposure change in shutter speed. So that gives us the idea of exposure equivalence. So I'm just going to give you, I'm going to try and give you a live demonstration of it. So let me see if I can do that for you. Okay, so I'm going to try and see if I can just do it with my iPad. Let me try that. Okay, so we have the Lightroom app. So you can see the Lightroom app on my phone right now, on my iPad right now. So if you look at the bottom, I'm in the Pro mode. I don't know if this looks like you can read it. So if I go to the ISO scale, I'm going to change the ISO. Can I change the ISO? Yeah, I can change the ISO. I'm going to change the ISO to 400. Okay, and I'm going to change the shutter speed now. So I'm at 1 by 200 shutter speed and at 400 ISO, and this is the photo I'm getting. This is the brightness of the photo that I'm getting, right? So let's say if I stop the shutter speed down one stop, so I go from ISO 200 to, from 1 by 200th of a second, if I go to 1 by 400th of a second, now obviously the photo has become one stop down or half the brightness. but I want the same equivalent exposure as before. I want the same brightness as before. So I can control that by increasing the aperture, increasing the ISO, and taking that up one stop instead. Now you notice the image is much more grainy, but the brightness before and after are identical, right? So it works on everything. That these concepts work on an iPad, it works on a cell phone, it works on a camera, it works on everything. Right? So that's how the idea of exposure equivalence works. Now that doesn't mean there's a free lunch. That doesn't mean you can just keep changing these things to get the right exposure and it'll work all the time. There are trade-offs and there are penalties. For example, a lot of people are saying that when we increase the ISO, we get green, right? We get graininess. That's a fact of life. So as you increase ISO, you increase something called you impact something called the signal to noise ratio. And higher ISOs will give you more grainy images. Now, in certain cases, those sacrifices are okay. In certain cases, they may not be okay. So if you're a landscape photographer, you actually have the luxury of using a tripod. So when you have the luxury of using a tripod, you can use a much lower shutter speed than you would if you were shooting handheld. So then you can use a much lower ISO, which will give you less grain. If you're a wedding photographer, then like me, a lot of the times I will actually sacrifice ISO. I'll shoot a very high ISO sometimes, just to make sure that I get a sufficiently high shutter speed so that I can get a photograph, right? So these are the ideas. So you saw the live demo of the exposure equivalence idea. So are there any questions? Bhuvnesh asked, can we do it by bringing the light source closer? So yes, but we're only talking about exposure for a given scene. I want to remove all the other parameters in this, right? Of course, I can make something brighter or darker by just making the light source brighter and darker. But some of the times that's not under our control. If I'm outside, I can't make the sun brighter or darker, right? So because I can't do that, we're only talking about what we can control in the camera right now. Okay, let's look at any questions. Does the noise reduction while we bump up ISO differ from Nikon, Canon, Sony, etc.? So Prachiti asked that question. It's a good question. So every camera manufacturer or every individual sensor, every particular sensor has a different noise characteristic. So if you have like an iPhone has a really, really tiny sensor, right? So it has a really tiny sensor and it will generally be very, very noisy as you increase the ISO. If you have something like a full frame sensor, so this is the size of a full frame sensor. So if you use one of those, they'll actually produce much less noise for a very high ISO. Now, in between camera manufacturers, also there's a difference. So there's not much of a difference. And nowadays, any camera that you buy will be fairly equivalent to any other camera that you buy across manufacturers. Right? So it doesn't make too much of a difference as long as the sensor size is the same. If you're comparing cameras with similar sensor sizes, the noise will generally be the same, right? Depending on the ISO. Okay, any questions? Any other questions? Hmm. So Chirag asked about EV -2, -10. So that's a part of what's called the exposure compensation. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about that when we get to camera controls. It's not something we're going to be talking about right now. Uh, okay, so I don't see any other questions on the stream about this. So we're going to move on. So now we're going to move on to a slightly more technical part of it. Now we might actually run out of time to do this. So I might actually push this to the next thing, but I'm going to give you a sense of how this works, right? So let's talk about metering. You have a camera, you have a lens. How do you know what the right combination of aperture, shutter speed, and ISO are there to get you a reasonably good photograph, right? So how does the camera know that these settings of aperture, ISO, and shutter speed are correct, or at least roughly correct, right? So if you notice right now, there's a camera shooting my image, right? I have an A7R3, a Sony camera shooting my video. So the camera's actually got a fairly good reading of the light on me and it's got a good exposure on me. I'm not too bright, I'm not too dark. It's decent. It's fine, right? Uh, oh, so there are a couple of other questions. So Abhinandan asked, what is the app that controls the ISO and other settings on iPad? So I'm using the Lightroom mobile app. That's what controls it. Yeah, Pratik has got that answer. Right. Now back to what we're talking about. So how does the camera know what readings to use to get a decently exposed photo of me or decently exposed image of me. It needs to be able to measure the light in some way. It needs to be able to actually get a reading of the light somehow. So it does that through a process called metering, right? So every camera, or rather not every camera, most cameras have a built-in light meter, right? It's a device that measures the amount of light that is on the subject, and then based on the amount of light on the subject, the camera can give you combinations of aperture, shutter speed, and ISO that will give you a reasonably well exposed image. Right? That's what it means. So we need to meter or measure the amount of light in a scene to determine the correct exposure, right? Now, the correct exposure depends on you as a photographer. The camera can't tell you what the correct exposure is. The camera is just going to tell you a rough approximation of what it thinks the correct exposure is. Metering is how your camera system determines what it thinks is the correct exposure. Middle gray or 18% gray is used as a standard of measurement. Now, this is interesting. Let me see if I have, I'll go over the 18% gray in a bit. But before that, we're just going to talk about the kinds of light meters that exist. Right? There are basically only two kinds of light meters. There are the incident light meter, and then there's a reflective light meter. So there are basically two kinds. The incident light meter, if you remember, if you anyone's watched America's Top Model or any of the pros shooting in the studio, some of them will use a light meter. It looks like what I have up on the screen right now. So it's a little handheld device. They'll put it in front of the model. They'll take a light meter reading, and then they'll put those readings in a camera, and then they'll shoot the photo. So there's a little bulb on top of it. So this little bulb measures the amount of light. Okay, so this is called an incident light meter. An incident light meter is a meter which measures the amount of light falling on the subject, right? Okay, so let me just make that clear with the whiteboard. All right. So let's talk about light meters. All right, my cat is back to her antics. Okay, so incident. All right, the incident meter. So let's say you have a subject. This is your subject. Okay, this is the camera, and you're shooting the photo of the subject, and you want to know what readings to use, what combinations of aperture, of shutter speed, and ISO to use to get an exposure, right? So you take the light meter. This is the light meter which I've showed in the background. So this is the little light meter, right? Whatever you want to call it. Here's the sun. So the incident light meter has to be pointed towards the light source. So the incident light meter is pointing towards the sun, and it is actually measuring the light falling on the subject, right? Remember this, it's measuring the light incident on the subject, it's measuring the light falling on the subject. So that's an incident light meter. The light meter, an incident light meter, must always be pointed at the light source, not at the subject. The light meter is not pointing at the person, the light meter is pointing at the sun, right? If you see a movie in which they're taking light meter readings and pointing the meter at the person, that's generally wrong. That's just incorrect, right? So they're not doing that right. Okay, so this is an incident light meter. Now, what's a reflective light meter? A reflective light meter is a light meter that measures the light reflected from a subject, right? Reflected off a subject. So let's say this is the subject, this is the sun. The sun is casting light on the subject, and from the subject obviously is going to reflect some light unless the subject is absolutely black. So it's going to reflect some light. So a reflected light meter is going to measure this light, the light which is reflected from the subject. Right? So that's how these light meters work. Now, the obvious question is, or rather the obvious differences are, a reflected light meter reading will always change. Uh, a reflected light meter reading will always change based on the reflectivity of the subject. So if a subject is pure black, the light meter will not get any reading. So it will give you a very high ISO, a very low shutter speed, a very large aperture to get an equivalent exposure, to get a decent exposure. But an incident light meter reading is independent of the reflectivity of the subject. Right? It will always give you the same light meter reading, irrelevant. It doesn't matter what the subject is. Now the obvious question is, all your cameras have a light meter. So which one is it? Does your camera have a reflective or an incident light meter, right? Which one is it? Anyone, if anyone has any ideas, you can put it up on the chat. Uh, it's a really obvious thing, right? If you think about it, it's very obvious. When you shoot a photograph, do you point the camera at the subject or do you point the camera at the light source to get a light meter reading? Right? You never point the camera at the sun when you're shooting a landscape, right? You always point it at the landscape. So that means that you're taking meter readings off the subject. You're not taking meter readings from the light source. So because that's the case, you're using a reflected light meter. All cameras have reflected light meters, not incident light meters, right? Now, uh, sorry, so how does a camera get a light meter reading, and what does it use as a frame of reference? So let's talk about metering again, and the idea of 18% gray. Okay, so I am just going to wait a second for any questions because it is already getting pretty technical, and we're going to be finishing off in 10 minutes anyway. So yeah, most of you got it right. It's a reflective light meter. It cannot be an incident light meter. Uh, TTL represents something completely different. It talks about something else. TTL is basically how the light meter works. It works through the lens. Uh, but the basic concept of the light meter, which is working inside your camera, is that it's a reflective light meter. Okay. Any questions before we move on? Because now I'm going to talk to you about the basics about how a light meter works. And once you understand the basics about how a light meter works, it'll make a lot of things very clear about why your camera generally makes mistakes when you get a light meter reading. So I'm going to wait a minute so you can ask any questions you have. And this is pretty much the last topic for today. So you can take your time and ask questions. Pranay, that's like a complicated question. In your camera, the camera does it for you. So the camera is also giving you a light meter reading and it's just giving you the numbers and it's telling you something is overexposed or underexposed. Right? So let me see if I can, let's see if I can do that on my camera here. You might lose the video feed for a second. Yeah, here we go. All right. So now what you have is my camera is giving me, all right. So if you look at it now, I'm just going to put this up properly, move this up. Okay. If you look at this right now, this is what my camera's light meter reading is telling you. My camera is saying that it's on auto ISO, so I can't tell you what the ISO is, but it's saying for whatever ISO it's shooting, it's probably something like it's probably like 400 ISO. It's saying that 1 by 50 and 2.8 will give me a decent exposure. Right? So that's what it's telling me. So this is the camera's light meter reading that you're getting. Again, an incident light meter, that's complicated. If I had one to show you, I would show you how to read an incident light meter, but I don't. So uh, I'll try and get one. It's difficult right now, but I'll try and get one and show you guys the next time. Okay, let me just put this back into the video mode. Yeah, here you go. Okay, it doesn't look like anyone has any other questions. So let's talk about light meters. Let's talk about light meters and how the light meter in your camera works. So now a meter is a meter, right? It has to measure something. And if you're going to measure something, it needs to compare against a particular standard. So for example, if you have a thermometer, right? A thermometer needs some frame of reference to measure. It can't arbitrarily measure something, right? It has to measure against something. So a thermometer will be calibrated, a degree centigrade thermometer will be calibrated against a boiling point and melting point of water. So it will be 0 degrees to 100 degrees, and that's how you calibrate it, right? Temperature by itself is meaningless unless you compare it with something, so you have a scale. So the comparison factor is really important. So just like any other meter, and you can see this for anything. For measurement, you have a meter or a foot or anything of that sort to get you that reference point. Sorry, my cat is going crazy again. Shh. No, no. Okay. So stop it. Stop. Sorry, sorry guys, just give me 1 second. Okay. Anyway, so just like any other tool that measures something, you need a frame of reference. And for light metering, and we use a frame of 18% gray. So 18% gray kind of looks like the gray that you see here on the side of my on my whiteboard. So it's that measurement. So what does this mean? Everything, every brightness is compared to this, right? Every brightness level is compared to 18% gray. So what does that mean? Let's say you take a scene. Okay, this is your scene. This is the scene that you're going to measure, right? And let's say it's very bright. Let's say it looks like this. It's almost all completely white, right? And you point your camera to this scene. You point your camera at this scene. What's the camera's meter going to do? The camera's meter is going to look at this and compare to 18% gray. And it's going to think, okay, so the scene I'm looking at, is it brighter or darker than 18% gray? Okay, how much brighter or darker is it compared to 18% gray? And what readings do I need to give the camera to make sure that it is 18% gray? Right? So that's the logic that is used for camera meters. So let's say in this case, it's very bright, right? You're taking a photo of a bright white object. If you're taking a photo of a bright white object, the camera will give you meter readings to not shoot a bright white object. It will make the bright white object darker. It will give you a grayish reading for it, right? So if you follow exactly what the camera is saying, if the camera meter is saying, white will not look pure white. White will look grayish. Okay. Now let's go the other way, and I'll demonstrate this for you guys right now. So this scene, let's say it's completely black. All right, I'm just going to use black here. Let's say you're shooting a very dark scene, right? It's totally black. The camera's meter is going to compare this to 18% gray and think that, is this brighter or darker than 18% gray? Obviously, it's much darker. So the camera is going to freak out and it's going to think that, oh man, this is much darker than it should be. Let me give you meter readings which will brighten this black object up to 18% gray. So your equivalent will actually look like this, will look gray. It won't look black. Okay, so I'll just try and demonstrate this to you uh, with with the Lightroom camera, with my iPad. I can't show you a very bright object. I can actually show you a very bright object. So I'm just going to put everything on auto. So I don't really need to control anything. I'm going to show you a really dark object. Okay, so I have a keyboard here which is black. Okay, so the back of this keyboard is black, right? You can see it's quite black. Now I'm going to put it in front of my iPad and notice what's going to happen. It doesn't look black anymore. It looks gray. So my camera is adjusting everything to get to middle gray, right? It actually should look dark like this. But when I put it in front of this, you can notice it's varying the brightness until it becomes gray. So now that's gray, right? So the camera has decided that 18% gray is correct. Now let me show you the opposite end of this. Okay, so all right, I'm going to show you a very bright screen, which is my cell phone screen. This is my cell phone screen. It's quite bright. It's so bright that it's not showing up properly on this. Right? So now I'm going to take this very bright screen and put it in front of my iPad camera. Notice now it's starting to look dark and gray. It doesn't look white anymore. It starts off white and then it immediately turns gray when the camera manages to adjust the exposure. Right? So that's how the idea of middle gray or 18% gray works in the camera's light meter. Now from this, you obviously know that it may or may not be right. So most things which you land up facing in real life are actually somewhat near this 18% gray value. So it doesn't make too much of a difference. But sometimes what will happen is you'll run into objects which are actually dark or bright, and then the camera's light meter readings are not correct for those situations. So to give you an example, let's say you're shooting a black cat in front of a black background, right? If you shoot a black cat in front of a black background, you'll actually land up with a grayish cat in front of a grayish background. So you have to know that your camera is making that decision, and what you'd have to do is underexpose the image intentionally. You would have to make it darker than what the meter says. So that's how 18% gray works. Are there any questions about this? I'll just wait for a few questions and then we can move on. And then there's just some very basic technical stuff, and then we'll be done for the day. So Swapna is asking, is it totally okay to depend on in-body camera metering? Well, that's what I do all the time. I always use the in-body camera meter. We shoot digital cameras right now, so you can just take a photo, see if the meter made a mistake, and then compensate for it. In the case of mirrorless cameras, you can compensate for the meter reading even before shooting the photo, right? So I depend on it completely. So 18% is a complicated thing, but that's considered to be middle gray. It's considered to be the middle brightness between pure black and pure white on a particular scale. So that's why that's used as a number for comparison. I'll tell you more about it when we talk about editing because it's a part of editing as well. It's a part of editing, it's a part of printing, so that 18% number is actually quite important. Uh, okay, let me just scroll. How to get everyone sharp in a group photo, that's going to happen in the depth of field class, which will happen later, I think next time. I don't know what that question means. Okay, so let's move on to the last thing, which is metering modes. So we know about how fundamentally a camera's meter works. We know that all comparisons that a camera meter makes are versus 18% gray, that value of 18% gray, right? But that's just the most basic way in which it works. All your cameras have different kinds of algorithms which are used on top of the concept of 18% gray, right? What do I mean by that? The camera can actually capture a bunch of light information. It can capture a bunch of comparisons. And then based on how that information is given to the camera, it can decide what readings to present to you, the photographer. So there are different ways in which the camera meter can work, and these are the three most common kinds of camera metering techniques, right? So metering modes rather. So there's the evaluative metering mode, the center weighted, and the spot metering mode. So let me tell you what those do. So these are just an overview of Nikon versus Canon. So Nikon has matrix metering. Canon calls the same thing evaluative. Nikon has center weighted average metering. Canon calls it partial. Nikon has spot metering. Canon also calls it spot metering, and Canon has another mode called center weighted average metering. And I'll tell you what all these things do now. Okay, so let me just get my whiteboard and then we can talk about it. Okay, metering modes. So let's look at the simplest one, the spot meter. So what is a spot meter? So a spot meter, if you look at your frame, if you look through your viewfinder of your camera, right, it'll look something like this. You'll have some focusing brackets here, and you'll have some information here, right? So this is the information that you'll have. So what is a spot meter? A spot meter is a way of metering which only uses a tiny area of the frame, generally the center of the frame, right? It takes a small portion of the frame, and you can see that here, and this the top right here. So this part, it takes a small portion of the frame and takes meter readings from this small area on the frame. Okay. So now, why is this good or why is this bad? So one thing, it takes a small area for metering. So anything outside this area, let's say you're taking a photo of a subject and there's a really bright object here, right on the side. this bright object on the side. This will not be used in the metering calculation at all. It won't make any difference if there's a bright object somewhere here or a really dark object somewhere here. It only depends on what's in the center, right? So, okay, so Amber asked a really good question here. So the camera knows it's supposed to not overexpose the image to 18% gray in night mode. So that's just, so how it works is even at night, nights are generally really dark, right? If you're not shooting in artificial light. So if you're shooting a night landscape, what will happen is the camera will look at the night landscape and realize that this is way darker than 18% gray. And it will give you meter readings which are way brighter, right? It will give you meter readings which will bring up that night scene to 18% gray. Which is why if you shoot, let's say you have, let's say a pixel, a Google Pixel, and you shoot a night photograph, it's actually going to make that look a lot brighter than it looks like in your by the naked eye, right? Because it's trying to bring it up to that 18% gray level. I hope that answers the question. So back to the spot meter. So the spot meter has only takes meter readings from that tiny spot. So it's good if the subject that you're trying to shoot is really small in the frame and you don't want something on the outside or around the subject to influence the exposure. It's great for that. So maybe you're shooting a bird and you don't care about the sky being blown out. You just want to make sure the exposure on the bird is perfect. Then you can use spot meter. Okay. So the next method is center weighted. So center weighted is this mode, which is on the top right of this presentation, the top right, which is here, right? So how does center weighted work? So center weighted metering works like this. So if this is your frame, same thing. These are the focus points. Center weighted takes readings from a large area of the frame, a large area in the center of the frame, but it puts more weight on subjects which are closer and closer to the center of the frame, right? So if something is here, that will influence the meter reading less. If something is in the middle, it'll influence it more. So earlier, like my film camera here, this guy, my old film camera only has center weighted metering. It does not have spot meter. It only has center weighted, right? So center weighted was how things were done usually. Okay. So I'll get to all the questions after I finish this because I just need to make sure we cover all this and then I'll get back to answering each of your individual questions. And the last mode is matrix or evaluative metering, right? Matrix or evaluative metering. So how does this work? This looks like this. If you look at the bottom right side where all the grids are, so that's how an evaluator meter works. So examples of your evaluator meter are all your cell phones basically use evaluator metering. I don't like my iPhone definitely uses evaluator metering. Uh, Almost all modern cameras have a matrix or evaluator metering mode. So how does this work? So the evaluator metering mode takes the frame, splits it into several grids like this. It takes meter readings from each of these points, each and every one of these points, right? And then it compares it against a database of a bunch of images that it has stored. And based on that, it will give you a meter reading. So for example, in this case, and nowadays this system is very sophisticated. So if you look at this seat on the bottom right, the camera actually has a rough idea that you're shooting a landscape. And it knows that the top of it is the sky and it knows the bottom of it is the landscape. So it'll look at the whole scene, it'll evaluate the entire scene, every part of the scene, and then give you a meter reading based on what it knows is the correct exposure for that given scene. And it has all the scenes stored in a database of scenes and it gives you those readings. Nowadays, evaluative has become so sophisticated. Uh, Sorry, my camera has shut down, so you can't see me anymore. But evaluative has so many scenes in it or so many zones in it. Now you have evaluative meters which have thousands of zones, so you can make very accurate comparisons between each one. Okay, so we are going to stop for now. So I'm just going to give you an overview of what we covered, and I'm going to answer questions that you have. So we talked about, what did we talk about today? We talked about the idea of exposure, right? We talked about the idea of underexposure and overexposure. We talked about the idea of stops, right? We talked about how to relate stops to aperture. And if you talk about the aperture scale, it goes something like this: 2, 2.8, 4, 5.6, 8, 11, 16, so on, with a difference of 1.4. And this, as the numbers get bigger, you're actually stopping down. As the numbers get smaller, you're actually stopping up, meaning making the photo brighter. You have the shutter speed. This is measured in seconds. And as the shutter speed, as the amount of time increases, the image obviously gets brighter. So if you have to stop up from 1 second, you're actually going to go to 2 seconds. If you have to stop down from 1/2 of a second, you're actually going to go to 1/4 of a second. But this is one stop down and this is one stop up. And then you have ISO. ISO is how sensitive the medium is, and it's measured in the ISO numbers. So it goes from 100, 200, 400, 800. As the numbers get bigger, you're increasing the sensitivity of the medium. So this is twice as bright. So this is one stop up, one stop up, one stop up, right? We talked about equivalent exposure. Equivalent exposure is if you have a combination of aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. If you have a triplet of these, so if you have something like 2.8, 1 by 100, 400, there are a number of equivalent exposures that you can get by stopping one of these up and stopping the other one down. So let's say I stop down the aperture to f4. I can stop up the shutter speed. It should be 1 by 50, but we use 1 by 60. And these two exposures will be very close. They'll be equivalent exposures. They'll be very similar. So that's the idea of equivalent exposure. And then the last thing we talked about is metering. Metering is how the camera is going to suggest these numbers to you. It's how these numbers are suggested to you. Remember, it's a suggestion. If you use your camera in automatic mode, then you don't have a suggestion. The camera is actually going to feed those numbers in, and you have no option but to shoot those numbers. Okay, so this is what we talked about. And we have spot, we have center weighted, and we have evaluative or matrix. Right? And all metering is done with a comparison against 18% gray. Okay, so this is the stuff which we covered today. So now I'm just going to go over some questions. So Chinmay asks, what metering mode is generally used in weddings? I don't know what most people do. I just use matrix metering. I use evaluative metering. Why? Because we have digital cameras. I can just shoot a photo and figure out if I got it wrong. Right? So I can definitely do that. And if you want to use matrix metering and an automatic mode, you can use something called exposure compensation to fix any mistakes in the exposure. So that's how I do it, and it works really well. Right? So I generally use evaluative metering. Vinayak is asking if 1.4 is half of 2 and then 2 is half of 2.8. Why are 1.8 or 2.2 there in some lenses? So that's a really good question. So the reason those are there is that those are 1/3 stops. Those give you the ability to fine tune the exposure. So even in shutter speed, you get 1/3 stops also. So you don't just go from 1 by 100 to 1 by 60. You'll get some intermediate values in there so you can fine tune the exposure. Otherwise, if you did not have those values, you would actually just be stuck with you'd be stuck with full stops of changes, right? Instead of having, let me just get my face up here so you can see me. I'll just put that here so you can actually see me a little bit, right? So that's why we have this. So we have 1/3 stops so that we can fine tune exposures. Yeah. Okay. Does the metering mode change if you put the camera in night mode? Definitely it does. Sorry, I should be clear. So night mode is a mode which is generally more amateur mode used in point and shoot cameras. The reason is that it takes away most of your decisions. So a lot of so if you look at my film camera, right? This doesn't have any modes. This doesn't have a night mode. It doesn't have any kind of modes on it. So the photographer is supposed to determine what the appropriate mode is for that scene based on the light meter readings and based on a bunch of other stuff. So night mode is basically an amateur mode that's given to you with a camera. All right, so I'm just going to wait on a few more questions before we end this session, but I'm going to put up what is there for our next session after this. So let me just shut this presentation down. Okay, so next time is actually going to be quite fun. So I know today was quite technical and very heavy on theory. So it was a very theoretical session. It wasn't very practical or very meaningful in that way. But it's important to know all these things so that we at least speak the same language, right? That's why I kept all this stuff. Next time we can have a really informed conversation between all of us. So if I say stuff like uh, control the exposure or stop up or stop down, you'll know exactly what I mean. We don't have to go over the basic fundamentals of it. Next time, what we're going to do is we're actually going to do this, which is we're going to use we're going to talk about the creative exposure parameters. That's what we're going to talk about. So we're going to talk about why. We're going to say why we have to change shutter speed. Why do we change aperture? Right? So we're going to answer the why question. Aside from just controlling the exposure, why should we change these two parameters? Right? That's why we're going to change. That's what we're going to talk about next time. Uh, is spot metering and partial metering the same? No, it's not. So partial metering, I believe, is something that Canon does, which uses a slightly larger spot than just spot metering. Oh, sorry. Let me just put the mind node back on. There you go. Okay, let's see. Aditya asks, is it true that changing the ISO makes a difference in colors? It depends. So as you start increasing the ISO, there are a lot of negative impacts that happen. Ideally, if you left it to me, I would shoot lowest ISO possible all the time. But if you change the ISO, you lose dynamic range, you increase a lot of noise, and yes, definitely, sometimes colors do change. But it depends on the camera and it depends on how high an ISO you use. So if you have a really nice camera, so I use a Nikon Z6, a full frame camera, it doesn't really change colors, it doesn't really impact image quality until you go past ISO 3200, right? Let me see what other questions are there. Okay, so I think everyone's sort of done with questions. Um, so the next session is going to be, let me just pull up my calendar. Let me just see when the next session is going to be. Okay, so we're going to be doing the next session on, there you go. So that's when the next session is going to be. Okay, again at 11 a.m. On Saturday, which is the 28th of March. And the next session's it's going to be, let's say, much more fun. We're going to talk about why we change all these things. Uh, Vinayak, 11 o'clock, as I mentioned on the thing. Um, Amar asked, is there any drawback less ISO, less number of 100? I'm not sure what the question means, Amar. Can you just rephrase that question and ask me? I think I know what you mean, but I don't want to answer the wrong question. Would you tell me which part are to focus in exposure? Rajendra, again, I can't really, I'm not sure what you're asking me. So could you just ask me that question again? Or just message me offline and we'll talk about it. Bhuvnesh asks, without altering any of the three components of the exposure triangle, can you alter the exposure by physically changing the distance of the subject from the light source? Yeah, Bhuvnesh, of course you can, right? So basically, if you take a person who's standing outside in the sun and you move the person into the shade, you're changing the amount of light. Right? If you change the amount of light, you're obviously going to change the exposure, assuming that you don't change any of the components of the exposure triangle. Right? So we don't talk about that part right now, just because we want to talk about the stuff that we can directly control through the camera. So changing the environment is something that you can either only do in the studio or moving the subject around. So that's why we didn't talk about it right now. But you're right, yeah, absolutely, you can control it. How you control it? Um there are actually infinite ways in which you can control it. You can change distance. You can block light. You can change the brightness of the light source itself. So it's a far-reaching and long topic. That's why we didn't cover it right now. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. It looks like everyone's done. So thank you everyone for joining. All as before, the session will stay online available to you. So you can view it later anytime. Please feel free to share it with anyone who might be useful. I'd recommend you just review the session once very quickly before the next time. And so that when you come into the next session, we're only going to be talking about aperture and shutter. Right? We're going to be talking about these two parameters and how they change the photograph over and above just the exposure. Oh, okay, I understand. Amar asks if you have ISO 800, keeping it less than ISO 800, is there any drawback? So the answer is it depends on the camera. So my Nikon Z7 has an ISO, has a base ISO. There's something called a base ISO. A base ISO is the native ISO of the camera. Shooting below that base ISO is a drawback. Shooting above it will increase noise. So on my Nikon Z7, the base ISO is ISO 64. If I shoot below that, I lose dynamic range. If I shoot above that, I increase noise and I lose dynamic range again. It depends. If you tell me what camera you have, I can tell you whether it makes sense to shoot below ISO 800, below ISO 100 or not. Right? My Z6, on the other hand, has a native ISO, a base ISO of ISO 100. So that's the best ISO to shoot at if I want to minimize noise and get maximum dynamic range. Right? I hope that answers your question. Lilesh asks, what are the different sources of light and how to know which source would be best for the scene and to capture the camera? So that's a really long and complicated answer. Uh, so there are different sizes, there are different distances that you have to vary. So we actually have an entire course just on this, and that course takes 3 weeks to complete. So I don't want to brush off your question, but I don't want to give you a bad answer either. Right? I don't want to tell you that these are the kinds of light sources and leave it at that. So we'll definitely go over it, but we'll have to go over it in depth. Okay, so Amar says that he has an Nikon D750. So Amar, for your camera, ISO 100 gives you the least noise and the highest dynamic range. The only reason I would go above ISO 100 on your camera is if you are not getting sufficient shutter speed. Mukund says in my A7R3, more than 800,000 gives noise, but in times in weddings I have to increase the ISO. Of course. So see, uh, it's better to have a good picture which is noisy than a bad picture which doesn't have any noise, right? So if you think you need to use 2000 ISO, I'll show you photos which I've shot, which in which I used 25,000 ISO, right? It's noisy, but the moment of that image was so good that no one cares about the noise. The noise is secondary. The moment is really important. The noise doesn't matter so much, especially in something like a wedding. In a landscape, yes, I would have definitely said try and keep the ISO low, try and control the noise because you can really control it really well. Rather, you can control those parameters really well in a landscape situation, but you cannot do the same thing for something like a wedding. Thanks, Prashant. I'm glad you enjoyed it. I'm just going to see if there are any more questions here. Cool. I'll just hang around for a few more minutes to see if you have any other questions. And let me put the the course outline back for everyone to see. right? So this is the course outline. So what we've done so far is we've covered this. We've covered the history part of it. We've covered understanding exposure. Next is going to be the fun one, where we cover creative use of exposure parameters. So that includes depth of field and fast shutter speed and slow shutter speed. So really, really fun stuff. Nilesh, so I think we'll have enough time, so I'm definitely going to actually do that course also online. So I'm going to try and cover that course online as well. Assuming we have enough time, I'm definitely planning to do it, yes. Yep. Okay, guys, I think that's it. I'm going to wind down now. I'm actually really tired and I need to have lunch as well. So good luck, everyone. And as I said, please uh, use these 21 days. We have 21 days in which we are forced to stay at home, and all for very good reasons. I encourage you to use these 21 days to learn something, to help someone else learn something. Everyone knows something valuable. So I encourage you to do sessions like this to share that knowledge with people. If you want to know how to set up a live stream like I've done for you, please ping me and I'll show you how to set it up. I'll show you what software tools you need to use. Um, it's important to support each other through all of this. So I would love to attend a session that one of you guys do about something you're passionate about and something you care about. So let me know if you need any help about if you need any help to set up a session like this, just reach out to me. I'll help you set it up. All right, guys, thank you. And I'll keep responding to the questions offline after the session is over. All right, thank you. Bye bye.